Right now, we will have the keynote about bridging science and policy, unlocking the transformative potential of biodiversity research. We will start with Elena Lazos Chavero. She's a professor and researcher in the Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Please, let's welcome her with an applause.
Well, I have the pleasure here to introduce one of the big challenges of this decade, in the sense that we are always talking about the challenge of climate change. And I think that the big challenge of this decade, it is this bridging between science and policy, unlocking the transformative potential for biodiversity research, that it will be presented today, now, by Dr. Marla Emery. It's a very challenging theme with many questions and many kaleidoscopic answers. What are the trends, challenges, opportunities for the future of evidence-informed policymaking? How can we build stronger science for policy institutions, networks, human and more than human welfares? How can we improve the governance of science for policy? How can we interweave diverse knowledges, scientific, indigenous, citizen science? How can we not only recognize the ontological frameworks among these knowledges, but also value and bring the diversity of values into the decision-making processes? While there is a broad agreement that policies should be informed by the best available scientific knowledge, the uptake of science into policymaking remains patchy and often ad hoc across different policy fields. Which knowledge has been valued more and why? What does it mean to consider only the scientific knowledge or the diversity of values and knowledges to co-build sustainability in our different societies? Scientific, indigenous, citizen, local knowledges and evidence are essential to inform policymaking, to help us identify and analyze problems, and to design effective interventions. However, in the current poly-crisis landscape, facts are uncertain, values are in dispute, stakes are high, and decisions are urgent. So a simple statement of scientific evidence is not enough. Instead, we need a systemic approach that engages with complex cross-cutting policy challenges, which means science-advanced systems must make use of interdisciplinary evidence and expertise, co-constructing with indigenous and local knowledges, a good understanding of policy needs, and the ability to communicate across policy sectors. In a world where governance and scientific expertise are under close scrutiny, policies based on scientific advice can also provide a rebuilding of public confidence in science. This confidence will be fundamental to be recovered if we are to respond with social justice to the complex problems that our society face, both today and in the future. But fortunately, we have persons, academic persons like Dr. Marla Emery, that I have now the honor to introduce you as our keynote speaker, and that she has not only the expertise of helping us to answer so many of these important questions around the multiple relationships that scientific, indigenous, citizen, community knowledges can weave with policymaking, but also has the sensibility and deep feelings of having participated in fruitful ways in spinning these interrelationships. In the United States, Professor Emery has been helping U.S. Forest Service and U.S. National Park Service recognizing uses of value of wild plants and fungi by indigenous people and local communities, and integrating indigenous and local knowledge in the development of policy to allow access for harvesting. In Scotland, in the post-evolution environment, she advised Scottish policymakers understanding the cultural and livelihood significance of harvesting wild plants and fungi as a basis for the development of Scottish policy to replace English policy. In Mongolia, Dr. Marla Emery, she evaluated social outcomes, especially for women, of a pilot project that established community herding and community forestry groups to inform national environmental policy in the post-Soviet period. In Colombia, she introduced social science research results to inform urban forest management in a lowland city, particularly the choice of species to provide food and medicine for displaced people. But not only she has had all this practical experience, Dr. Marla Emery served as co-chair of the assessment report on the sustainable use of wild species produced by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBS, which was approved by the 138 IPBS member states in July 2022. And there is where we met. We were suffering with our colleagues the battles in order that our assessment reports will be approved. The methodological assessment of the diverse values and valuation of nature, where I was participating as coordinating author, and the assessment report on sustainable use of wild species were in the way to be endorsed. Dr. Emery received her doctorate in geography from Rutgers University, and for 31 years, as I told you, she was the social science researcher with the US Forest Service, where investigations focus on sustaining cultures for diverse communities. Currently, she is the scientific advisor to the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research with a special remit to bring the insights of the social sciences to bear on ecological research and policy questions. So a big applause, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Elena. Pues, queridos colegas, primero quiero decirles que es un placer estar aquí con ustedes y quiero agradecerles a la Universidad San Francisco de Quito y a la ciudad de Quito de extendernos tan calurosa bienvenida. Si me permiten, cambio al inglés. So it is my pleasure, truly a delight to be here with you to bring into the important conversations that are happening here today and tomorrow, the results of the, I pronounce it IPBES, many people pronounce it IPBES, and other people pronounce it IPBES. So those are all synonyms for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So I am very excited to share with you the results of our assessment and bring that into the conversations happening today. I had the honor, as Elena said, to co-chair the assessment with my colleague Jean-Marc Fromentin, a marine biologist from France, and John Donaldson, a terrestrial ecologist from South Africa. I'm going to bracket my comments today with two stories. One, a story that is a case in which things did not perhaps go so well. And the other one at the end is a story that is much more hopeful. So that first story, actually, antes, momentito, gracias. Both of these stories are located geographically in the global north, but both of these stories involve indigenous peoples. And you may know that in the United States, federally recognized indigenous peoples have status as independent sovereign nations. And by virtually every measure, almost all of these communities meet the criteria for low and moderate income countries. So I hope that you will agree with me that the lessons from these stories have broad global impact. And the first story takes place in the traditional Southern Sami territory of Norway. Ahora sí, gracias.
See behind me are part of one of the largest wind farms in Europe. They're also the reason why there aren't any reindeer roaming the area of Fosen anymore. Reindeer used to roam this vast area of mid-Norway only a few years back. Now, the animals are long gone. Instead, one of Europe's biggest wind power plants is dominating the area of Fosen. But the wind power development has made it almost impossible for the indigenous Sami people to herd reindeer. In an unexpected ruling late last year, Norway's Supreme Court stated that the wind turbines was built on permits that are no longer valid. The reason is that the permits breaches the Sami people's right to exercise its culture.
Det som er unikt jo det at det fåtallet som lærer seg å kjenne naturen så godt som det vi gjør. Vi lærer oss jo å leve med den, gi og ta. Og det med å ta vare på det man har, det er jo kultur i seg selv. Det som man selvfølgelig frykter for å tape, det er jo at hvis det her nå ikke går rundt, så sier det seg jo selv at da må vi jo slutte med reindrift, for det er ikke liv laget, så da har vi jo ikke noe å holde på med, og det er jo det som er det største tapet, rett og slett alt bare forsvinner. Det er virkelig tap av kultur.
The Samis and several NGOs now demand that the wind plant, consisting of 151 wind turbines, is being dismantled so the animals can return. So far, nothing has happened. The turbines are still in operation and Norway's government hasn't offered a solution yet. On one hand, the government has said that it will be a world leader when it comes to indigenous people's rights. On the other hand, the nation needs renewable energy, and the government could also be held responsible for the wind company's loss if the turbines are to be torn down. Norway's new government has described this as one of the most difficult cases in several years. Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre said in February that he understands the Samis' frustration, but that there is nothing in the ruling that implies that the turbines has to be dismantled. As the government is looking for solutions, nobody knows if the reindeer will be able to return to the area where they've been winter grazing for hundreds of years.
Are we on? Yeah. So this is clearly a case in which the social science either wasn't done or wasn't used. And the outcome is evidently and manifestly unjust. There are legal violations and a lost opportunity to address both the climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And something that we see all too often, which is, again, when we don't do the science well in developing policy, we may develop policies to address one of those crises that exacerbate the other. And as you heard, if it is required that that wind farm come down, that those turbines be dismantled, this is going to be extremely costly. And it's also really bad press. No less than Greta Thunberg has been in Oslo protesting with Sami against this wind farm. So that's a cautionary tale. Now I'd like to, with that as background, shift to sharing with you key findings from the IPBES Sustainable Use Assessment that perhaps give us clues as to how to make that bridge between science and policy so that we avoid outcomes such as Wind. Let me give you a little context for the IPBES Sustainable Use Assessment. It was requested by the now almost 200 parties to IPBES and by the Convention on Biological Diversity and by CITES. The objectives in the scoping document were to analyze status and trends, identify drivers and causes of changes in uses of wild species and their sustainability, consider approaches that enhance the sustainable use of wild species, and identify challenges and opportunities, and finally, ways to strengthen practices and measures and capacities and tools for engaging in sustainable use. This was the work of 4 years by more than 80 scientists who were drawn very consciously and carefully from the social sciences, the ecological sciences, and interdisciplinary sciences. And our work was supplemented by the work of 200 additional contributing authors. And taken as a whole, the experts that worked on this assessment represent more than 50 countries in all global regions. Additionally, and extremely importantly, we were able to incorporate Indigenous and local knowledge in the assessment. And the ways that we did that were to hold 3 dialogue workshops with Indigenous peoples. Now, our work spanned the pandemic and including the tight lockdown period. And so 2 of these dialogue workshops were conducted in person, the first one in Paris, that's the photo down below, and the second one in Montreal, that's the photo up above. The third one was necessarily a virtual workshop, and that turned out to be actually a blessing in disguise, because we held it in 4 sessions, which allowed us to engage people at more sane times of day located around the world, and also gave us the opportunity to hold one of those sessions in Spanish with simultaneous interpretation. Further, we put out a call for contributions and received a rich array of responses to that, from Indigenous communities, community management plans, to works of art, to scientific articles that Indigenous communities had been partners in producing. So let me share with you some of the key findings now. First, uses of wild species are social ecological systems. And in order for us to address them and ensure their sustainability, we must give equal attention to the social and the ecological components of them. What you see here on this figure is the conceptual framework around which we organize the assessment. And you see in that green box on the left that we addressed a wide variety of species groups. So aquatic species groups, plants and fungi. We know that trees are plants, but they're substantially different. And from a policy standpoint, they are dealt with very differently. So trees and terrestrial animals. The uses to which wild species are put are varied and very significant. And these include ceremonial and ritual uses, our decorative and artistic uses, energy, food, education, construction materials, medicine and hygiene, and recreation and others. Those species and their uses are connected by practices, what human beings actually do on the ground in order to prepare to harvest, process, and distribute the wild species and products made from them. And we found it very useful to divide those practices, to look at them through the lenses of fishing, gathering, logging, terrestrial animal harvesting. And let me pause for a moment to explain to you why that somewhat tortured label was put on it. We include in the category of terrestrial animal harvesting lethal hunting, but also non-lethal uses of animals, notably, for example, the shearing and release of guanaco and vicuña. And finally, non-extractive purposes such as ecotourism. What we found is that billions of people rely on and benefit from uses of wild species. And this is in the global north as well as in the global south. I mean, we know it's intuitive that that's the case in the global south. It is also the case in the global north. And uses of wild species make fundamental contributions to culture. They provide direct material for survival of body and mind. And they are sources of income. Very large portions of those sources of income take place in through informal market exchanges, but also formal market exchanges. And that's a bit of a challenge in terms of putting an economic value on uses of wild species, since by definition, the informal economy does not leave clear records. 1 in 5 people rely on wild species for food and for income. And 2.4 billion people, that's 1 in 3 people globally, rely on fuel wood for cooking. We found documentation for the use of over 50,000 wild species, that is species of algae, animals, fungi, and plants. And of those, over 10,000 were used for human food. And we know this is an undercount for both of these numbers. But it gives us pause to think about the contributions of wild species for food security and, importantly, food sovereignty as well. And their contributions in terms of nutrition and health, especially with a crisis in metabolic diseases, what they contribute to, what these high quality foods in many cases contribute to preventing metabolic diseases. Sustainability in the uses of wild species is critical to reverse biodiversity decline. We've already heard that the IPBES global assessment has identified overexploitation of wild species as one of the 3 largest contributors to the loss of biodiversity. And in fact, we know that overexploitation is the #1 cause of loss of biodiversity in oceans. And it is the #2 or the #3, depending on how you count it, contributor to the erosion of biodiversity in terrestrial ecosystems and in freshwater ecosystems. But there's good news. We know how to do sustainable use of wild species. We have examples of it all over the world. We have examples that have millennia and more history behind them. And we have examples of things that have previously been unsustainable and returned to sustainability. And what we see then is that effective management for sustainable use has demonstrated local conservation successes, again, in many parts of the world. And further, in some cases has contributed revenues to support protected areas and restoration of ecosystems and habitats. And here I'd like to note, along with several of the earlier speakers this morning, that Indigenous peoples and local communities are important stewards of biodiversity. Indigenous peoples steward 40% of terrestrial conserved areas, and among those, the most diverse. In fact, sustainable use of wild species is central to the identities and the very existence of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And here, it is important for us to note that those uses depend upon abundant and healthy populations of wild species. Their sustainability is grounded in Indigenous and local knowledge, the practices that grow out of that, and the worldviews or spiritual practices that underlie them and provide incentives and disincentives for following through with them. Now, Indigenous cultures are different. There are many. There is no one Indigenous culture, but what we saw over the course of doing this work is that whether it was Maori in Kenya or one of the Indigenous tribes in the northeast of Russia, or one of the Indigenous tribes, one of the First Nations of Canada, the one thing that was consistent with regards to uses of wild species and their sustainability among Indigenous communities were fundamental principles of a requirement to engage in relationships with the species that are going to be used that are characterized by respect, reciprocity, and a sense of responsibility. And indeed, a sense of relationship, not metaphorical relationship, but literally being relatives. Indeed, sustainable use of wild species is so essential to Indigenous peoples and local communities that loss of opportunity to engage in sustainable use of wild species represents an existential threat to Indigenous peoples and local communities. And I think we saw that in the Fosenvind example. So what do we know about the status and trends in uses of wild species? Well, what we know is it depends. I realize that's not ever a very satisfactory answer, but it's the real answer. And what does it depend on? It depends on the type of use, the scale of use, and very importantly, the social ecological context of use. There are many drivers that lead toward sustainable or unsustainable use. And just to give you an example of a very few of those drivers, pretty obviously, environmental things like climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. Let's pause for a minute to think about climate change. So we know that climate change is going to change the distribution of populations of wild species. It may cause, for example, wild species that are fundamental to some cultures and some livelihoods to move out of the range of access of those peoples. At the same time that it may cause new species that could occupy those same similar cultural and livelihood niches into their territory. It is going to rearrange ecosystems in ways that have profound social implications and profound implications for uses of wild species. Global trade, clearly a big one. So over the last 40 years, global trade in wild species has increased dramatically. And in many cases, unfortunately, that increase in global trade has led formerly sustainable uses to become unsustainable uses. Happily, in a few cases where good management has been instituted, it has been possible to restore sustainability to those systems. An interesting subset, or an unfortunate subset, of global trade is illegal harvest and trade. And I think that all of us who were working on the sustainable use assessment were frankly gobsmacked when we learned that global trade in wild species is the third largest by value illegal harvest, group of illegal harvests in the world. So also lack of attention, especially when, as is not uncommon, not infrequent, a use of a wild species is identified as a potential development strategy. Lack of attention to gender and equitable distribution of costs and benefits can lead to both ecologically and socially unsustainable outcomes. But we see that efficient governance, strong institutions, education about sustainable techniques, and public awareness can lead to and reinforce existing sustainable uses of wild species. So let's talk a little bit about the methodologies that we might need and that might be available in order for us to monitor the sustainability of uses of wild species and implement policies that would support continued sustainability going forward, or that would lead to the restoration of sustainability where it has been lost. So indicators and monitoring are obviously fundamental to this. But we've got some issues here. So let's pause for a minute and unpack this graph. And I'm gonna sit behind the podium, stand behind the podium, so that I can do that more easily. So you see in this figure, it is divided by the practices: fishing, gathering, terrestrial animal harvesting, and non-extractive practices. These circles that you see immediately to the right of the practices are an indication of the documented number of species in use. And the bars to the right of that are the indicators that are in use, that exist and are in use. The light green indicators are ecological indicators. The dark green, the sort of aqua, and the red bars are social indicators, management, economic, and governance. And then that light orange bar there is other indicators, things like equity, distributional justice. And what you can see here is the biggest circle for gathering has the second to lowest number of indicators. And that other category is really small. We do not currently have the means, an agreed upon set of indicators that will allow us to assess the justice and the equity of uses of wild species. It's useful to note that indigenous peoples and local communities have their own sets of indicators that they find extremely useful. And those indicators are greatly underused in global processes of monitoring. But where scientists and Indigenous peoples and local communities have come together, there are some amazing and innovative examples from all regions of the world in which ILK, Indigenous and local knowledge, has become the basis for very useful indicators. Unfortunately, however, monitoring programs are chronically underfunded. It does us no good to have indicators if we cannot implement them, and if we cannot then gather that data and process it and use it to influence policy. And here again, there are some marvelous examples of Indigenous peoples and local communities and scientists coming together to do monitoring. But all too often, that is volunteer labor on the part of the Indigenous peoples and the local communities and paid labor on the part of the scientists, and that clearly has some justice implications. So what about scenarios and models? So there's the monitoring, and then there's the projecting forward. What if we do this? What will be the outcome? There are some wonderful models out there for harvest impacts and models that include both ecological and social components for individual species. And here, if you're not familiar with the work of Tamara Tickton and her students on harvest of plants, I would recommend their work highly. What we found, however, and this was another place we were surprised, was we could not identify one single scenario that looked specifically at uses of wild species. Certainly there were scenarios that could be useful, but no scenarios that specifically addressed uses of wild species. And when we think, as Deputy Executive Director Emrema said, about the urgency of sustainable uses of nature, the fact that we don't have any scenarios is a bit of a problem. So when we do get around to developing scenarios, and I hope maybe some of you in this room might be among the folks who will do that for us, we need to be sure that they incorporate climate change considerations. And that has to be very fine scale, very local climate change considerations. Big models aren't going to do it. That we consider increasing human populations and consumption levels. And that we look at technological developments. And technological developments cut both ways. There are times when technological developments make it possible to reduce things like bycatch and effect on non-target species in an environment. And there are times when technological developments have exactly the opposite effect. So think about big drag nets in the ocean that scoop up anything in their path and along the ocean floor. They can have a devastating impact on both species and habitats. And when we develop these scenarios, it is going to be essential, because we're talking about social ecological systems, that they combine the social and the natural sciences and that vital knowledge that is included in Indigenous and local knowledge, but again, through just processes that are not extractive or exploitative of Indigenous and local knowledge. Through, as Elena mentioned in her introduction, through co-production processes, not extractive processes. So with that in mind, what are some policy and management pathways to help us toward more sustainable use of wild species globally? We found that there are 7 key elements that characterize effective policy development. Inclusive and participatory decision-making, in which all stakeholders have a seat at the table, and there is care to pay attention to power imbalances and address them and remediate them. Inclusion of multiple forms of knowledge, notably indigenous and local knowledge. Careful attention to equitable distribution of costs and benefits. Clearly, we need policies that are tailored to local, social, and ecological contexts. There are absolutely principles for sustainable use of wild species that are applicable across that vast variety of species groups and the tremendous diversity of social and ecological contexts. But when it comes down to a particular use of a wild species, there is no one-size-fits-all prescription. We have to be looking for policies that are tailored to the local, social, and ecological context. And we have to be monitoring at that kind of a scale, again, both the social and the ecological components of the uses. Coordinated and aligned policies are also really important. Bossenwind is an example of when that didn't happen. So we need to be looking at making sure that, for example, energy or infrastructure policies don't conflict with environmental policies and ultimately lead to unsustainable use of a wild species or even the elimination of a use of a wild species. And finally, robust institutions, and that includes customary institutions all the way to statutory institutions, the institutions of indigenous peoples and local communities and the ways that they govern themselves, all the way to how nation states govern themselves and how we as a global body of nations govern ourselves. What we see here in this figure is that those kinds of key elements are present in legally binding agreements, in certifications and voluntary agreements, in strictly voluntary agreements, and then sometimes some of them are not present anywhere. And what you see here is this very interesting diversity across practices. So in terms of fishing, we've got a lot more legally binding terms that require these key elements to be implemented. In gathering and in logging, we are primarily relying on certification and voluntary processes. For terrestrial animal harvesting and things like ecotourism, we're really just relying on people to do the right thing. Going forward, sustainable use of wild species is going to require adaptive management. In fact, sustainable use of wild species, and I would argue that sustainability as a whole is not a single fixed target or place that we will ever arrive at. We have to be continuously monitoring, especially in an era of accelerating climate change, assessing what that's doing to both the species, the non-human species, and the people involved in the use, and then adapting our uses, adapting our management strategies in order to stay sustainable in a changing world. Reservations about indicators and targets notwithstanding, we just wanted to throw up here for you that sustainable use of wild species is already contributing and is acknowledged as contributing to many of the SDG targets. But what we find is that sustainable use of wild species can contribute, has the potential to contribute to, or is actually contributing to, the realization of many other targets. And it will benefit us, I think, to acknowledge that. So let me, before we go to story 2, which I want to give the last word, say a little bit of something about how the science of the sustainable use assessment is being taken up into the policy process. I am very happy to say that the results of the sustainable use assessment were taken on board and influenced the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Framework. I was in Nairobi for the Substa 25 a couple of weeks ago, and again, there was very much influencing the development of the framework. And in addition, a number of nations around the world are taking this information on board as they develop their policies for 30 by 30. So a case in which the science is clearly influencing the policy and hopefully will also be influencing what happens on the ground. And now I'd like to leave the last word to some Indigenous peoples from a cultural group with which I have worked a great deal and a species around which I have done work. So this is the White Earth Tribe. They are Anishinaabe, also known as Chippewa or Ojibwa cultural group, and we're looking at wild rice.
They are making wild rice here on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. It's a time when the Anishinaabe take to the lakes with our ricing poles, our canoes, our bawaganuk, our ricing sticks, and it is a time our families gather to harvest our most sacred of foods, minomen. Minomen are wild rice, the food that grows on the waters. That we were instructed in our migration story to go to the place where the food grows on the waters. It's our most sacred food, first food eaten by a young person, a baby, and usually the last food served to the elderly. This is served at our feasts and ceremonies. Where there is wild rice and minomen, there are Anishinaabe people. We take to those lakes and rivers and we pole through to collect our wild rice. It's hard work, what our people are doing, but we're very, very proud as Anishinaabe people of being the people of the wild rice that we can feed our families, feed our bellies, and feed our souls as our sacred food. We're also the people who are able to make a living for our families through our wild rice. Our community fought long and hard to stop the genetic engineering of wild rice and has also worked to try to keep some of this wild rice and the value added in our communities. As large corporations took our wild rice, domesticated it, and now 95% of the wild rice that is marketed in the United States is coming from diked rice paddies in Northern California. We don't call that wild rice, we call that tame rice. It doesn't taste like a lake. It doesn't smell like a lake. This is our people coming in. We're proud this time of year. Our families are able to eat and we're able to bring some money home for our communities and for the winter. This is our native harvest wild rice being purchased at Lakeside. This is on one of our trailers, and we were good. We paid the best price out there for the rice so that people could get the best money for that hard work they had. Families going home with hundreds of dollars for a day's work, which really makes a difference in our community. And they're proud. A lot of these people, young men, this is something they're really, really proud to do to continue their traditions. Our rice comes into our rice mill here on the reservation. This time we're hauling it in our horse trailer. Sometimes we use the big trailers, but sometimes we use a horse trailer when that's what we have. And we're happy to be able to offer our wild rice here. We're going to be parching this rice for our families, our community, and for our customers. Thank you for joining us. Miigwech.
So we have 6 minutes left in this session. And if you will indulge me, I'd love to take a few questions. And Lena, would you like to come up and moderate? And to those of you who are participating virtually, we're going to try to keep an eye on that.
No, perhaps 2 questions from here and 2 questions from the virtual platforms. Yes. Could somebody give that microphone to her, please? Or I lend you mine?
Thank you. So thank you for the really rich discussion and points that you bring to the table. And well, my name is Laila. I am from the IAI and I'm from Brazil. And I work in similar issues. And I was one of the things that you said struck me about the graphs on the indicators are pretty intense. The most important thing to people is the least measured. And you said the indigenous peoples have their own indicators. They are not really used. I'd love to hear your insights about how to use them. Also relating to the translation issues that this brings to the table, not just about language, but also by working with indigenous peoples, I realized that some of those indicators are not quantifiable. So how can we approach them with the due respect? I mean, and I'm not sure if I was clear, but
You were crystal clear. And that is such an important question. You really get to the heart of that particular issue. It is certainly not a simple thing to do it and to do it right. But we see that it is done sometimes. And where it is done, it is where long-term relationships of respect are established between those who have access to power and the trappings of power, money, position, the ability to influence global processes, and the indigenous peoples and local communities who hold that knowledge and make a commitment to co-producing knowledge and to doing it in a way that is equitable, that shares costs and benefits. But this is not a short-term process. This is a long-term challenge.
May I just add something? I was going to add something. It is because also we were working with ILK communities, and in the sense that there are indicators that are managed by their own and under their own wisdom and knowledge. So there are indicators, no? Only that, for example, to arrive to consensus, no? And we don't use them, no? In so-called democratic societies, no? And how they use the consensus indicator is very important for them, and how are these indicators used by them, no? Only that we don't have like this correlation, no? Only I want to add something. We have time for other 2 questions, and that's it. Yeah, on the back.
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask, how do you manage to assure effective communications among this diverse group of scientists preparing this assessment and between sciences and policymakers, which is the objective of this the international platform of biodiversity and ecosystem change?
Right.
Which is one of the biggest barriers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. And made all the more challenging by the pandemic. Because one of the ways that we establish that effective communication is by traditionally, historically, is by meeting in person, and by meeting in person as often as the funds will allow us to meet in person. But then the pandemic happened and suddenly we couldn't meet in person. And many of our experts are on the other side of the digital divide. And so they get left out of our virtual meetings, or they're not able to be present in video, only in audio. So those are the challenges. What I would say is there was a commitment on the part of the three co-chairs. I am a social scientist. My other two co-chairs were natural scientists. There was an immediate sense of respect and mutual respect for our sciences among the co-chairs. And then it was essential to us to make that be the tone of all of our interactions. And I might add that we paid attention to each other as human beings. And that has a powerful effect on how people work together across disciplines. We checked in with each other, especially during the pandemic. How are you doing? We paid attention to, as a human being, as a member of a family, how are you doing? And then we established in our meetings and in all of our work a norm of respectful listening and of asking questions when you really don't understand what the other person is saying because you don't have a shared disciplinary basis. You guys are asking all the great complicated questions. Thank you. But the other half of your question was communication with policymakers. Well, we've been spending a lot of time giving talks and showing up at, I was in Montreal for COP 15. That was 15? Which COP was that? Anyway, December 2022. I was at Substa in Nairobi two weeks ago. And I will say that IPBES has an excellent communications office, and they do a very good job of helping to connect all of the assessments with policymakers and in policy fora in order for us to share the results of our work. It really is a massive benefit and quite a privilege to have the institution of IPBES because it facilitates those communications with policymakers in the most important places for the work to get to. Yeah. So, as scientists, we're not allowed to actually be in the negotiation processes, but we will provide all the information that we are asked for very happily.
Then I think, time is over, but thank you very much for your questions and for your attention. Thank you very much, Marla. It has been a pleasure.